In the year that King Uzziah died, it's easy to skip over these opening words to our text, especially given Isaiah's spectacular vision that follows. But they are important words. You see, Uzziah, who became king of Judah when he was only 16 years old, reigned for more than half a century. And he was a good king. In fact, he was one of the most successful kings of Judah, with his reign marking the height of the southern kingdom's power. During his reign, the nation prospered, and desert areas were reclaimed by water conservation. Jerusalem's walls were reconstructed, towers were added, and engines of war were mounted at strategic points. But as often happens with the rich, the successful, and the powerful, it all went to his head. And when he attempted to burn incense in the temple, something that was reserved only for priests, instead of saying, "Oops, my bad," he became angry when the priests tried to send him from the temple. And immediately, God struck him with leprosy, causing him to live in quarantine until his death 10 years later, while his son took his place on the throne. So in other words, things had been going gloriously for Israel, and then it all came crashing down because of Uzziah's pride. God seems to stop using us when our pride swells up, because it's that pride that causes us to forget that it wasn't us who got us to where we are, but it was God. It wasn't our skills and management of life, but it was God's grace. And so things were looking pretty bleak for Israel. The nation's super monarch was dead, and they just weren't so sure what the future held for them. And that's when God showed up in all of God's magnificence. High and lifted up, as the contemporary praise song says, shining in the light of your glory. We read that there were fire creatures called seraphs flying around the temple in which God was seated. And as they flew, they sang praises to God, and their songs shook the very foundation of the temple. Quite the spectacle. Smoke everywhere, with God sitting up there on a throne, and the hem of God's robe flowing down and filling up the temple. It was enough to humble the proudest person alive, enough to silence the lips of the boastful braggart, enough to destroy the illusion of human power in a divinely created cosmos. In that moment, Isaiah came to the realization that there was indeed a God, and neither he nor Uzziah nor anyone else were it. In that moment, when the hem of God's robe filled the temple, Isaiah's eyes were open to the reality of who God was and who he was, and how finite the rest of the world was in contrast to God's boundlessness. Every once in a while, that still happens. Every once in a while, the hem of God's robe spills into the everydayness of our lives, and we see things as they truly are. Michael Coffey captures that every once in a while moment in his poem, God's Bathrobe, when he writes, "It spilled holiness down into the sanctuary, into the cup and the nostrils of the singing people. One thread trickled loveliness into a funeral rite as the mourners looked in the face of death and heard the story of a life truer than goodness. A torn piece of the robe's edge flopped onto a war in southern Sudan and caused heartbeats to skip, and soldiers looked into themselves deeply. One threadbare strand of the divine belt almost knocked over a polar bear floating on a loose berg in the warming sea. One silky string wove its way through Jesus' cross and tied itself to desert-parched immigrants and with swollen tongues, and a woman with ovarian cancer and 2 young sons. You won't believe this, but a single hair-thin fiber floated onto the yacht of a rich man, and he gasped when he saw everything as it really was. The hymn fell to and fro across the universe, filling space and time and gaps between the subatomic world with the effervescent presence of the one who is the is. And even in the slight space between lovers in bed, the holiness flows and wakes up the body to feel beyond the feeling and know beyond the knowing. And when you come to that cataclysmic moment when an encounter with God causes you to feel beyond the feeling and know beyond the knowing, you are transformed. When you see the world as it really is, when you come to the conclusion that God's power and supremacy is responsible for the beauty of the earth, and when you hear God crying out, "I need help," you can't do anything else but respond with the words, "Here I am." That's where Isaiah found himself in this morning's text. Even with all the majesty that this morning's vision conjured up for Isaiah and for the reader, God calls out almost like a small child, wondering if there is anyone out there who can provide a helping hand. Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? You see, for some folks, their experience of God is that of the mighty ruler of the universe sitting upon a heavenly throne in all God's majesty. God is in control even if it doesn't feel like it. The Unitarian minister Theodore Parker said in a sermon given in 1853, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." If that sounds familiar, it's because Martin Luther King Jr. used this quote in a speech given at the National Cathedral in 1968. And it's the sort of idea that sits well with some of us, this idea of an all-powerful God who has everything under control. But for others, God cries out for assistance. God has a dream for the world, one in which there is no polar bear floating on a loose berg in the warming sea. And there are no desert-parched immigrants with swollen tongues. And there is no war in southern Sudan or anywhere else in the world. And in order for God's dream for the world to become a reality, God needs our help. And so for some folks, their experience of God is one of quiet intimacy, in which God asks us for assistance in the healing of a broken world. And for still others, God is both lifted up and intimately personal. And if that sounds like a contradiction, well, it is. But so is the Holy Trinity. And so is the idea that there's a spark of goodness in even the cruelest of people. And so is a spirit in which resides both hope and despair. But whatever our experience of God may be, if it's truly an authentic experience, It will be one that transforms us as it did Isaiah. And as we are transformed, then we open ourselves to becoming instruments of God's peace. Who will go for us? Over here, God. Here I am. Amen.